So hello to them. And we have many people here, I'm glad to say, with us live to ask questions
And make comments.
and make comments and engage in dialogue. As we said when we put out the call for this, putting out the podcast, it's kind of a little what like shouting into the void. So it's very good to get a chance to talk about what we've been talking about, especially during a momentous week like this. Andrew, is there anything you'd like to cover before we start just opening the floor for questions?
No, let's hear from people and they can hear from us.
Yeah, so what I would like to do, what I think would probably be best and most orderly is because we're on Zoom, if people could use, if you know how to use your raise hand feature, and that way I'll unmute you and you jump in with your comment, question, and we'll take it from there. So whoever wants to ask the first question, please.
And the raise hand is among the icons on the bottom of the screen. If you've got a screen that looks like mine, it's to the right of the chat and it's to the left of the share.
Okay. First question from the audience.
Hi, this is Ravi. Just what happened? I mean, WTF? There's we've got a situation where, like, most of the commentary in the closing weeks of the campaign was saying that, yeah, the Democrats are hopeful. The polls are suggesting that Harris is ahead in the swing states, and yet it was completely like all the pundits were wrong-footed, almost all of them, that we see over here. Why did they get it so wrong? Over.
Let me jump in on that, Gabriel.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's a lot closer of people's initial perceptions because the vote was still being counted and is still being counted. California, which is the largest state by far, has only counted 2/3 of its vote, and that's a heavily Democratic vote. And that's Trump in the end will have a margin of less than 2 percentage points. He may not have a majority. It's kind of touch and go. The polls were off. They weren't hugely off, okay, but they were, let's put it, consistently off. I mean, the poll aggregates were, some for Harris, some for Trump. But I mean, nobody was thinking that Trump was going to just take 7 states. Wisconsin was close, Michigan was pretty close, Georgia was pretty close, North Carolina was not, Arizona was not, and of course Pennsylvania, that was hugely not. My view is partly that although the pollsters missed the Trump vote in 2016, a portion of it, and said they repaired their problems. And then in 2020, when they repaired their problems, they had the same problems. I mean, Biden won, but Biden's margin was expected to be about 8%. It came out to be about 4%. We've seen the same thing again after continued promises. My strong suspicion is that a lot of Trump voters are just, not willing to talk to the elites who conduct polls, right? And so everybody makes guesses. as to who's going to vote. So that's partly what's going on. Also, the information from the exit polls is that people who made up their minds at the last moment went relatively strongly for Trump. So even the polls up to the last minute or close to the last minute would not register that. And then there is the huge issue of people who seem to have voted in 2020 that just sat this one out. I don't know how many people like that there were. I think we'll find out in the weeks to come. We don't especially know why they sat it out, who they are, why they sat it out. We don't know that at this point. But what I want to emphasize is essentially there is no change in the sentiment of the US voting population, or the voters, I should say, since 2016. We've had 3 very close elections. And, you know, the electoral map this time looks almost identical to the electoral map in 2016. The big difference, of course, in 2020, when Biden won, was that the blue wall held Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Also, he picked up Georgia. But what we're seeing are movements between, you know, the 45-yard lines. There's not a massive shift in the population. Something we should talk about, I think, is that the Trump victory here is in line with all of the defeats and reduced vote percentages for incumbent parties, for governing parties all throughout the world this year. Let me find this graph. I'm not going to show it. I don't know. But this is from the Financial Times. Every governing party facing election in a developed country this year lost vote share. And that's the first time this has ever happened, going back to 1905. So we're talking about 120 years, and it's never been the case that every governing party who faced an election has lost. Maybe they didn't lose, but their share of the vote went down. But here that happened. And in the US, the fall in the vote share was a lot less than in most of these cases. It looks to be about, I don't know, 4%, 3-4% in the US. In this other country, it was the governing party was down 20% in their vote share. I'm assuming that's the Tories in the UK. Then there's a lot of them in the middle. So there's an anti-incumbent thing going on that most people are attributing to continuing economic problems and related problems having to do with the COVID pandemic. Over.
We've got a couple questions on the stack, but I wanted to come in on Robbie's question really quick and say to what a great question to open on what happened, which is, as Robbie was indicating, that the pundits were saying she had a pretty good chance, or that it was a coin toss. And, you know, I think no one expected him to sweep those states and then to, you know, win the popular vote. That was the real stunner. I think it comes down to a variety of factors, which Andrew touched on, and I'm sure we'll continue to touch on in this call and as we continue to work through this. But, you know, what at base the issue is, it's farcical that the man was on the ballot. It's farcical that he was allowed to get to this point and run, and he had to steamroll through, you know, legal challenges to him being on the ballot, the illegality of him being on the ballot as an insurrectionist, and so forth. And the fact that that was allowed to happen alone was the first failure, right? And that's what made this possible. The spitting in the face of legal precedent and institutions. I mean, that's par for the course for him as a fascist, but um, that allowed this to happen. So once he's on the ballot, he's already won in a sense, and then he won. He won what I think he feels is a mandate, and it can certainly be interpreted as that. He is more than likely all three, um, branches of government, and he swept the swing states. I'm going to go to the next question. I see Floyd in the audience, so I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Thank you. I was seeing over the last few weeks or so this thing. And a number of people mentioning about blue MAGA. If that is a thing, then what is it? And if it is a thing, then did it play any role at all? So, I mean, I did note that the role. I did note that the total vote of Jill Stein was something like over 200,000, but of course, that would be spread out, throughout a number of the swing states of which they were, of which they were aiming for. The other thing is that if the actual vote itself might be 0.2 percent, between the Democrats and the Republicans, then does that lead to a constitutional crisis? And the reason I ask that is because there is a comedy show that I watch called Veep, and I think it's in season 2 or perhaps in season 3, where she thinks that she's won the election, and it turns out to be basically 59 point. So it turns out to be an actual split, and then both sides are running around like headless chickens because, of course, that has never happened before, and so there's no constitutional precedent for it. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that art follows life, or indeed life follows art, but nonetheless, if you want to go with that analogy, then then obviously it does place the validity of the state, and indeed maybe democracy, in question, especially given the fact that Kamala has already conceded. So has there been ever a precedent where the person who's conceded and then it turns out that they didn't lose, as it were, is it possible to overturn, if you see what I'm saying, the vote itself? Like I said, that's assuming, of course, that it is as close, and indeed, that it is recognized that it's close.
It's not close in that sense.
Right.
I didn't mean to say that it's close in the sense that these results could come to favor Kamala Harris. The electoral votes, he's got a clear majority, I don't know, 312. That's not in doubt. What is somewhat in doubt is what the popular vote will look like. He might not get a majority, but she will not have a majority either, and she will be down. She will not have as many votes as Trump, so he will win the plurality, even if not a majority. And in any case, concession does not mean anything. The voters decide, not the candidates.
Yeah. And what happens in that story arc in Veep is that it's a tie in the Electoral College, because a tie in the popular vote doesn't mean anything. So they had to take it to the House, which there was actually, some speculation, because they were saying it was so close. It was such a coin toss. What if this went to the House? Well, if it went to the House, Trump's Trumpist in the House, Mike Johnson, would have handed it to him. So that was something that needed to be avoided. But we didn't even need to go down that route. He just won it outright. I want to go to your question, though, about Blue MAGA, because you're getting at something that's the most frightening development of this election. And it's something that, it's everything right now is inchoate, and we don't know how it's going to go. But the terror that I have right now is that there are members of the Democratic Party who have serious platforms and are on television a lot and are important in the party, who are basically talking about turning their party into a collaborationist party for the Trumpists. Their response to this loss was to say, we're creating too much space for trans people in this party. We're not being tough enough on immigrants, and we have to do the work and be part of this government that's coming into power with a mandate. That is that is a real, that's a blue MAGA development. That's a party turning itself into no opposition at all, into a collaborationist party in a desperate attempt to, I don't know, retain relevancy, to avoid execution. I don't know what they're thinking, but it could be the most terrible outcome if there is no mainstream legal opposition to Trumpism from another bourgeois party. Um, it will fall on, as we have said on this show before, and as MHI has said in its many statements on Trumpism, mass movements of resistance, because the Democrats might be abandoning their responsibility to resist this.
Right. But I would say that major voices in and around the Democratic Party are not going down that road. They are going down the opposite road of, we need to fight, we need to continue to fight, all hope is not lost, even mandates can be thwarted and reversed. And Senator Elizabeth Warren had a plan, and she put it out, I think it was on Thursday. It's in Time magazine. You can read it. Let me see if I can just quote some of what she said. She again said, incumbent parties across the globe have been tossed out after the pandemic. The people who voted for the Democrats don't expect us to roll over and play dead. There's going to be a vigorous challenge from the party out of power. Here's a path forward. Fight every fight in Congress, fight his nominees, put checks on his administration by, calling for investigations and having hearings. She reminds us that Trump did not manage to gut the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. She says, fight in the courts. It's very tough because the courts are very extremist, but, quote, litigation can slow Trump down, give us time to prepare and help the vulnerable and deliver some victories. She also says Pentagon leaders should issue a directive now, reiterating that the military's oath is to the Constitution, in other words, not Donald Trump. And in the Senate, Leader Schumer has to use every minute of this remaining legislative session to confirm federal judges and key regulators that can't be removed by the next president, at least according to the current interpretation of the law, which Alito and Thomas and the other insurrectionists can, of course, overturn. It will. So there's that. You got the Never Trumpers saying fight hard. William Crystal is among them. You've got, of course, people like the historian Timothy Snyder saying that. You've got the legal scholar Lawrence Tribe, saying fight. You got people on MSNBC like Ali Velshi. So there is a strong sentiment to fight. Reproductive rights people are saying we're in for the fight. We're not capitulating. We're not giving in. And among the most important things are what's going on in the states, not the United States, but the individual states. Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, has called the legislature in California back into session to try to Trump-proof, that's the new term, Trump-proof California against, attempts by Trump just to do what he wants in that state. So they're going to mount legal challenges and whatnot. In Illinois, Governor Pritzker is announcing something very similar. The governor, Maura Healey in Massachusetts, something similar, and attorneys general throughout the country, in the Democrats are starting to band together. So that kind of part of the resistance is already back in formation right now. What remains to be seen is what the mass movements are going to do. But it's really very interesting to me that even the people who are more official-like like the Lawrence Tribes of the world and the Elizabeth Warrens of the world, they are understanding that the source of their ability to do anything and the source of our ability to hold off Trumpism to some extent rests with the mass movement. This is another thing that Elizabeth Warren said. Let me try to find it. Yeah. She says, remember that during the first Trump term, mass mobilization, including some of the largest peaceful protests in world history, was the battery that charged the resistance. There is power in solidarity, and we can't win if we don't get in the fight. Okay, and you know, she's a left of center liberal. And she's recognizing the power of the mass movement potentially. So what we need to do is to hear from the mass movement, and we'll see. I mean, it's an open question. People have been fighting for years and years and years, and things are not looking good. On the other hand, you know, it doesn't matter whether things are looking good. Some things are existential. You know, they're about to take your parents away. You know, or you're bleeding in the hospital parking lot because the doctors are not allowed to give you medical treatment because you're pregnant, blah, blah, blah. So sometimes people fight because there's no alternative.
On a grimmer note, I think a point that could be made about a difference between now and 2016, 2017 is in that early period of the first Trump term, the resistance was such a broad structure across media and across business institutions, and it was, you know, very broadly supported, right? So much so that you had the Uber CEO, you know, Travis Kalanick. He was on Trump's advisory council, and he faced so much public shame and scrutiny that he left. Like this was a big hubbub in 2017, right? Now, big business is much less afraid to just have completely rallied around him. I mean, it seems like that's uh, one change between now and 2016 is big business has chosen a side, as they usually do in the case of fascism. They're on the team of the fascists, and he is surrounded by high-level CEOs, Musk, billionaires like that. All like you know, they're no longer yielding to shame, right? Um, they're on Team Trump. So that's a different part of these battle lines, right? Now we can no longer shame the people with deep pockets who might end up on an advisory council or being business advisors into not working with Trump. They don't care about shame anymore. Um, they see an opportunity for profit and expansion of their business or what have you. Um, that's a frightening change, I think. I don't know if you agree with that, Andrew.
Yeah, I agree. Jeff Bezos collapsing, refusing, you know, telling the Washington Post that he owns not to endorse Harris when the whole editorial board written the editorial already. That was a bad sign, but that was evidently not so much as generalized fear of fascism and what Trump might do as an attempt to gain some favor in terms of what economists call rent-seeking behavior for his space endeavor. But Elon Musk has obviously muscled him out of that. So that'll be interesting to see which way he goes. I think that things can be done still in terms of economic pressure from, you know, on businesses. But we'll, you know, we have to wait and see what the battles become. In other words, when Jeff Bezos did this, the Washington Post lost 10% of its subscriber base immediately. That was before the election.
Yeah.
So, well, you know, he doesn't need the money from the Washington Post, but businesses that do need the money to stay in business, that kind of thing could become important. One does not have to buy their products. One can go elsewhere.
Right.
But there are more creative economic boycotts that people can think of as well or execute. Um, like at various times, people have said, don't travel to this state, that state. There's a lot of states now that are ripe for, not doing businesses, not having conferences in them, and so forth and so on. And people say, well, it hurts the people in those states. Well, yeah, I don't disagree with that. The problem is we don't have a lot of options in terms of how to fight. This is very, very bad. And let me just say the one thing in terms of Blue MAGA and the capitulationists and all of that, their mindset is still on this really risky strategy. I think people have not gotten their heads around just getting rid of it because it doesn't work. Of we're going to stave off fascism by appealing to some 3% of people in the middle, 4 or 5%, and nudging them slightly in our direction because of how we talk or the buzzwords we use and the ones we don't use. And you see how goddamn stable that is. It didn't work in 2016. It seems to work in 2020. Then it doesn't work in 2024. It's a game of inches, and it's extremely risky, and it has completely failed. So it seems to me that we just have to walk away from and tell people to walk away from that whole discussion of what we're going to do to win the Trump voters back and the people in the middle back. And the way we're going to save ourselves is by the people who want democracy in this country, the people who need liberal democratic protections, who need abortion rights, who need civil liberties. They need to mobilize. We need to be in solidarity with them and help them. And that points a direction forward. And maybe that will change some minds.
We got a bunch of questions lined up, but I just had to say this off of what you just said, Andrew. I couldn't be in more agreement. And the thing that I keep coming back to is what you're saying right there. I think that the reality is Trump won. He won decisively, but he did not win a majority of this country, and he never could, even in his best case scenario. I don't know, I probably shouldn't prognosticate like that, but he is unpopular. His policies are unpopular. People don't want to live with the consequences of Dobbs or crushing authoritarianism. And people fully recognize a chunk of this country that was willing to resist to avoid 18-year-old girls dying of ectopic pregnancies that could be treated and they could be saved, or people getting police knocking on their door because they had the Plan B pill shipped to their house from out of state and getting asked, did somebody in this house take this? People don't want to live like that, and they're willing to resist, and they resisted the first time. The thing is, Trump and fascists, they prefer not having the majority because they posture themselves always on the war footing. And so this game that you're talking about, Andrew, that they're playing of like, we'll adjust this word and we'll maintain trans legal protections, but we won't talk about them, and we'll get tough on immigrants too. It's just conceding ground to the Trumpists. It's conceding ground to them. And Trump,
and it doesn't work.
It doesn't work. It's provably false, but he's also by persisting, just by being around, he has so warped the political structure around him. He's done so much damage to the functioning of democracy just by persisting that he's shifted everything to where people who are in the political sphere, a lot of them seem to think that they have to, speak in his language. You do not. There are people who are fighting who are trying to point the way towards an alternative, a truly anti-Trumpist politics that could save us, from human extinction. I mean, we're looking at a globally destabilized world where we have this fascist strongman who thinks he's a tough guy and says he would use the nuke. That's the thing we're fighting here.
Yeah, the world is in very, very grave danger, and the people who thought this was a U.S. problem and they didn't care about it, it's coming back to bite them.
Yeah.
Especially in Europe, God forbid. Oh my God! Elon Musk is on a call with Putin.
Is on the call with Zelensky. I mean,
Yeah.
He's setting up ground war in Europe beyond Ukraine,
Yeah, for sure.
and that what that would unleash is, but the fact that we have to hold to is that people want to resist this. They have a capacity and have shown the way before in the fight against Dobbs, in the fight against Trump the first time, in the Women's March, in the Black Lives Matter struggle, to set the terms of their struggle for their own dignity and liberation that is beyond the discourse of Trumpism and winning a couple inches and winning by a couple percentage points. It's
Right.
by smashing this and achieving a greater freedom. Let's go
I,
to a
I
question,
agree, but let me get a little bit overly dialectical here. You said
please.
people. Okay, there's people and then there's people. If somebody hears this, I'm just worried. I know what you mean, but I'm worried some people might hear what you're saying as we can appeal to people because when push comes to shove and they feel the real brunt of the higher prices from the Trump tariffs, and they don't have anybody to do, their gardening and roof repair, because immigrants do it, and they don't have anybody to work in their businesses because immigrants do it. When all of these consequences of these Trump policies come to bite them, then they're going to move back in the other direction. Okay, that's not the people who are going to learn from the hard experience, right? Even to the extent that they do feel consequences. Okay, they will not draw the right lessons because they never have. Think back to 2020, 2021, and the COVID pandemic, and President Drink Bleach, right? With his goddamn policies, who's killing hundreds of thousands of people all the time. What is it that they concluded? Well, let's vote for him again in greater numbers. Whatever economic consequences, they're going to be blamed on the lizard Jew globalists, whatever it might be. I just, especially now with the way media bubbles and all this stuff works, I just don't trust these people to be able to connect the dots between their experience and the policies of the Trump administration.
They don't want to. They're disinterested in connecting.
People don't want to. I mean,
they do not want to. And
right.
This line is back again with his cookie tariff nonsense, where they're saying, well,
right.
if he does this, he'll hurt his base and they'll turn against him. They don't want to turn against him. They like that he hurts people they hate. That's what they're in it for.
Or they think that he's hurting people that they hate instead of them. But it doesn't matter because they're unwilling to look at facts, because facts, that's a bunch of liberal elitist stuff. I mean, what's really kind of shocking, one of the bigger shocking things to me about the election was it looks like about a quarter of the people who voted in, state referenda in favor of abortion, protecting, extending, whatever it might be, a quarter of the people who were on the pro-abortion side voted for Trump. Okay, so that shows you people not connecting the dots, even in the most rudimentary way.
Yeah. There are no consequences for his actions, right? Unless he's made to face them.
Yeah, and that's the other thing is, to the extent that his policies are kind of narrow, even if they hurt a group of people, he manages to, paper that over. He did that last time with his tariffs. We're screwing over farmers in, I don't know, Iowa or one of those,
and they were all killing themselves.
And he gave them subsidies to cover. Yeah. that's like Trump's MO. One problem, one solution, another problem, another solution, another problem. That's the stupid mindset. It managed to work for that to placate those people. I don't know if it can continue to work, but I just don't trust that people like that, who are inclined to vote for Trump are going to all of a sudden start to respect facts and put together cause and effect in a normal way. That's not what they're about.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to pin you. I have a question from the audience. Ralph, would you like to go?
Yeah, is there a danger that he will abolish the entire election system so that he and his base will never have to vote again?
He'd
Yeah,
certainly like to.
there's a danger. I mean, the more likely danger is that we get something that looks like Russia or Hungary, where there's a formal election, but the opposition has no chance of getting power. That took time in Russia. It took him a long time. It's taken time in Hungary.
Yeah.
One presumes it will take time in the US. But look, it's been taking time. This is not something new. This is going back to 2010 with the the funding.
Tea
You know what
Party?
I mean? Well, the Tea Party, but the court decision, the Supreme Court
Oh,
decision.
Citizens United.
Yeah, that's the one. Thank
Right.
you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you explain that? I'm kind of tired.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, Citizens United had was a Supreme Court decision in 2010 that basically allowed unlimited spending on elections, and so corporations just started buying elections. But that's how they interpreted it, and that's what's really striking, though, and shows how far these processes have gone. Is Sherrod Brown, who just lost in Ohio. He lost his Senate seat. Sherrod Brown was the first sort of Citizens United election. It got a lot of press at the time when he was up for election after Citizens United because they threw a lot of money in a PAC, political action committee, that had been unregulated by Citizens United against Sherrod Brown. Several corporations did. I think largely oil. I don't remember, right? And it was obscene amount of money at the time. This is how people were reporting it. I remember Jon Stewart on the Daily Show saying it's so much money. I think it was something very small compared to what he just lost against. The amount of money he lost against is a factor of 4 or 5 times that. So, and Brown put up actually a fairly good fight, but he still lost decisively in Ohio. And what Andrew, I think, is getting at by pointing back to Citizens United is the creeping anti-democratic tendency in American politics of the last nearly 15 years. And I think it is very pronounced. I think the point that Andrew makes of Hungary and Russia is very strong. I would also point to Poland. Poland is an example of how it can be somewhat walked back. The Polish Law and Justice Party took a beating in the last election, and they were limited by EU membership in some of their legal dismantling of the democratic functioning of Poland, and they were able to get knocked back by that because there were actual legal restraints on how much they were damaging democracy. And then they lost an election, and that's now there's work being done to undo that damage. But it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, and it took a lot of many years. Law and Justice was dominant in Poland for many years. Orban looks kind of unstoppable right now, and he sends over his cronies to go hang out with Trump. I also think a model for Trump in terms of a democracy, undoing democracy, is Perón. For like one more from this hemisphere, he loves the musical Evita. So there's damage he can do without banning elections. I mean, I think the damage he's already done to the democracy of this country is kind of unmeasurable.
I would agree. I don't think we live in a democratic country anymore, especially because of the SCOTUS decision to give him immunity regarding basically everything, as far as I can see. That's part of it. The fact that, as you were saying earlier, the fact that he was allowed to run for office at all is a massive blow to the rule of law. Okay? I mean, they were saying, let the voters decide. Well, I don't know. I listened to all of the debates and everything regarding the election. I didn't hear many voters saying, I'm going to decide, to cast my vote on the basis of whether I think Trump is guilty of, stealing government documents, of inciting insurrection, all of this. What that stuff about, letting the voters decide means overriding the rule of law and making everything a popularity contest, because you like a guy who stands on stage and has oral sex with a microphone. Okay, to each his own, but what happens to the rule of law? So, though we don't live in a liberal democracy anymore. We're not yet in fascism. We're kind of in a middle thing right now, between the two. I'm extremely worried, and that's the other thing that is driving me crazy about this talk about, all the recriminations within the Democratic Party and the circles around it. Oh, Kamala Harris said this on The View, and Walz is not the guy. It should have been Shapiro. No, it should have been this. And oh, Biden this and age that. And the Democrats are too elitist because, it's elitist to put up a woman, especially a Black woman, because that's just not, in tune with what the voters in the country are comfortable with. I mean, all of this crap. It's all presuming that there is going to be a next election that's fair and free, and that we can, overturn what's coming in an electoral manner. There's no reason to believe that for a moment. There's not any
obscene.
reason to believe that.
It's obscene, and we have to also look to what's been making me the most sick since this happened is seeing the same conversations happen that happened in 2016, the same line of arguments attempting to be trotted out by the same people. And even and MHI has rightly taken a very hard stance against soft on Trump accommodationism on the left, and we will continue to do so. But even well-intentioned liberals, meaning well, trotting out these arguments too, as if it's the first time. We can not learn anything. We should have been learning things. Maybe in 2015 is when we should have started at the latest, but we can't still not be learning anything. We can't still be having the same conversations that we know are wrong about appealing to these people and about economic anxiety. It's gone. It needs to be that argument has to be in the dustbin of history where it should have been, after the 2016 election. We shouldn't have ever, but the fact that we're trying to have these again. And to what Andrew's saying about the Democratic Party, I largely agree, but the one thing I would say is I think that the Democrats failed in a large sense, and Harris failed in a large sense because she abandoned a lot of Biden's points on threats to democracy. She ran against him almost as if he was a normal opponent. And that's why these recriminating games that they're playing with each other of did we lose because of this? Did we lose because of that? They failed by not having him in cuffs. They failed by not, letting him get on the ballot. That's their real failure, and that is a massive failure. It's a massive failure that they thought we can win by a couple percentage points, we can play an election game against him, and we can defeat him at the ballot box. No, 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 no.
Absolutely right.
That was a huge failure.
And they're not going to go down this road, but when the Supreme Court gives the president absolute immunity or near absolute immunity, blah, 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 one of the core powers of the president is to defend the country against all threats, foreign and domestic, and what is Trump? I mean, he's like the walking threat to the country. Biden, in fact, still has the power to stop this from happening constitutionally, according to the Stench Court. I don't think he's going to do it. And I don't think it's because, it might be because he, still has some nostalgia for, the norms of old. But what I'm more worried about is that already the power is not there and has not been there for some time. Like if the Democrats were to try to pull the kinds of shit that Trump pulls, the corporate donors, some of them would, turn these guys out on the street, or portions of the military, portions of the whatever, FBI, whatever it might be. I've been worried about that. One of the really good things is that there are top people in the military, not that I look to them for leadership, but it's important that top military people, warned against Trump and said and when Elizabeth Warren says, they should issue a directive coming down from the top that the military is there to defend the country and the Constitution, not to do the bidding of the president. She's not, just wishful thinking. There is that sentiment among the top brass of the country. If there is a popular uprising, and I think we can expect to see the start of it, we know what the instinct of Trump is going to be. It's going to be the same thing that he had in mind in 2020.
When the looting starts, the shooting starts.
Yeah, the Black Lives Matter protests is like, shoot them. Well, we can't do that. It's not constitutional. Well, how about just shooting them in the legs, right? Well, and the military resisted. Now, what happens this time? Will the military resist? If it does, will portions of the military break off because the Trumpites are fomenting a split within the military? If that doesn't happen, will Trump have organized a private militia based on Proud Boys and the rest of those kinds of lunatics? Maybe they'll do it. And then he's got plausible deniability. So if they start shooting into crowds, what happens to the resistance at that point? These are the things that I'm worried about.
Let's take a question from the audience. I'm going to ask you to unmute and then come on.
Hi. Just recently, in an early conversation, you said, Andrew, that the percentage of the voter share is actually going down. But that still doesn't really explain why, across several countries in the world, we've seen incumbents being thrashed at the polls, such as the UK, New Zealand, Japan. We've got the German election coming up soon. We had France, which was almost like a near miss. It's essentially what are the voters saying? That we want a new government? Is it the fact that we have inflation? We've come out of a COVID crisis, a COVID lockdown. So it's really kind of understanding what is the electorate saying by throwing out the incumbent at such a high rate. Over.
Yeah, let me try to clarify my point. I didn't say that the overall vote share has gone down. What I said, and I'm just repeating the statistics that a lot of people have pointed to, and that I had a graph from the Financial Times about, in the last year, in the developed countries, the parties in power that were up for an election, they all had a drop in their vote share, the vote share for those parties. So it doesn't matter whether it's like the Democrats in the US or the Tories in the UK, they're all going down. And the general pundit explanation is, yes, it has to do with the hangover from the COVID pandemic.
It might
Because
be
there doesn't seem to be any ideological consistency to this. This is not like a populist, right-wing populist surge. You know, that it looks that way in some countries, but not in others.
It might be a correction too to what a couple of years ago was reported to be found, that if you were in office went during the pandemic, regardless of how you handled it, poorly, well, you did nothing, you did something, you had a sort of a bonus to your incumbency effect. Those politicians kind of around the world did better just from having been in office during the crisis. And whatever that was, they were on TV more, people were used to them. Maybe it's a correction to that you know there was an incumbency boost a couple of years ago, and now there's a pushback against incumbents. Um, let's have Jane from the audience.
Hi. So I don't have the exact data, and so I can't say exactly, but there was data showing that in certain areas that Trump got a huge portion of Black, Latino, and Jewish, often male vote, like a lot more than would be expected. How did we miss the very idea that the racial classes would vote against themselves in such a large way? And how do we account for that? And what do we do with that idea moving forward? Like I wasn't blown away by the idea of it, but I was blown away that I hadn't really thought of it as being such a valid force. Over.
I have a lot to say on this, Andrew. If you want to go first.
No, you go first.
I'll just say with the Latino vote, that's something that's been going on for a while, and that's because I think of a lot of complexities in that demographic, especially for America, that it's kind of a missed by white America that groups them in as a census category. Whereas the fact of the matter is those Latino voters that are called Latino voters are many times they're very white American, maybe even literally in appearance and in mindset. They've been here for many generations, and they've come up from countries where they retain views of other people from South America who migrate there, right? And there's a lot of reporting that'll be shocked by that, but it's a reality that there are
Ted
Latino
Cruz
voters.
is Latino.
Right. There are Latino voters who would say, I don't want those types of people coming here. And white Americans would say, well, there are other Latinos, but for them, they're not. They're from people that they look down on, and so on. So I think that's been going on for a while, and I think that's the consequence of the fact of just the American census, just grouping in such a huge population that has such a different and distinct background, and so on. So I wasn't as surprised by that. On the black male voter thing, I had to say, I don't know what Andrew will say. I'm becoming more and more frustrated with how that's being reported, and that black male voters still vote for Democrats more than almost any other demographic of men. Almost every other demographic of men votes more Republican. Black male voters still overwhelmingly vote more for Democrats than almost any other group of men. And if there is one thing to say about the Kamala Harris pitch, I did think that the kind of haranguing of the black male voters that are still very loyal to the Democrats for not being sufficiently loyal, I think that left a poor taste in my mouth. I think Obama going up and kind of saying, you guys are probably, not going to vote for her because she's a woman. And you had Spike Lee I saw on CNN. He said, Obama has always been too soft on black men for how sexist we are. And I'm not saying there doesn't need to be interrogation in every community about the treatment of women and sexism in those communities. That's not what I'm saying. But I think what it indicates to me is that the Democrats are, instead of trying to build a broader base and, create a new type of politics. They're trying to hold on to what they already have, and they're punishing the people in that coalition if a few of them are not towing the line. And who they're punishing, I think, oddly, is usually the people who are in the party and are still loyal. They're haranguing them for sticking around. And I almost worry, like, I don't, will these guys keep turning out for you if you just keep saying you're so bad because so many of you have stopped voting Democrat? I don't know. This is something I've been thinking about this week.
Yeah, I don't know that. First of all, on the question of Jews, I saw the exit polls were like 80% of the Jewish vote went against Trump, which is about like the average. I think it's higher than average.
Especially women. Jewish women voted for Harris
Yeah,
more decisively than any other
right.
demographic.
Then you got like a lot of the Orthodox Jewish communities, and they're going to be more pro-Trump. And it's not so much even about Israel. It's about they're right wingers, like what's that twerp who does the podcast all the time?
Ben Shapiro.
Yeah. And then people even more, ultra orthodox. I agree with what Gabriel said about the category of Latino. It's a catch-all. There's a lot of different ethnic national groups. You got Venezuelans, you got Cubans, you got Puerto Ricans, you got Mexicans, and so forth. And also the division between those who've been here a long time and those who are new, etc. With the black voters, I didn't interpret what Obama said in the same way. And I wouldn't, it certainly is not punishment. I mean, it's most criticism. And what he was getting at was, I don't think it was a matter of, oh, you're not being loyal enough to the Democratic Party. I think he was just plain saying, a lot of you guys, it's the woman, and you don't want to vote for a woman. It's like, get over it because the alternative is Trump. That's how I took it. And he was speaking as a fellow black man. I don't know how much, he has that cred to do that, but that's what he was trying. There is a problem within the black community in that for the Democrats, there's a particular problem is that the kind of loyal Democratic Party people in the black community, they're old. They're in the churches, they're in, like groups like Sharpton's group and so forth. Younger people, not so much. There's Black Lives Matter, there's stuff. But in general, I mean, this is a large part of the problem we face is the institutions that bound people into communities coming out of World War II have largely crumbled. Social media, curating your existence on your phone, all of that. So whether it's a physical community based on location or any other kind of community, those things have largely gone by the wayside, like the unions. The US voter on average is not less sophisticated now than 50, 60 years ago, but the unions used to have a lot more people and be able to do propaganda more effectively and turn out the vote on election day for the Democrats.
The Rotary clubs, the churches, they're all gone. Yeah.
And the black church is still one of the few things that exists that's not part of the right wing.
It's one of the very last holdovers, which is why Atlanta is one of the only areas in the country that saw improvement for the Democrats.
Right. But see, even the black church is really a thing of the older people. It's not so much the younger people anymore. So you take away the unions, you have a dissipation and atrophying of the power of the black church. left political parties. Most of that kind of stuff is gone, and people are atomized and individualized. The right wing has been very good at creating institutions and communities and things for people to belong to, and the left has not. And when people make all these criticisms about the elitism and the wokeness and the piece, all of that kind of cultural stuff about the liberals and the Democrats, the one thing that really rings true is just their distance and disconnect from people on the ground by and large. It's a real problem.
Yeah.
People are not embedded in communities, because that's the way you can actually talk to people when they're actually your neighbors, when they're actually your coworkers, when they're actually people you come into contact with every day. We don't have that. We have increasing geographic separation. The liberals move to the cities and so forth and so on.
We have two questions. I want to take the two. Then I want to read our who we are statement, and then I think we'll do a bathroom break. Before we go to that, I just want to thank Andrew because that answer was so good, and I think he gets at why the discussion around black male voters, that phenomena frustrates me so much, and because everything Andrew just laid out is really what's going on, and we're seeing it happen in live time now to black male voters because they are losing some to the Republicans, and they're losing them because this is a segment of the black male population that is disconnected from these older structures that are losing power. And a lot of the times they're listening to things on their phone that have a kind of, put yourself first. The Republicans are going to be good for business, and you could make a buck, doing whatever you're going to do in doing that. And the reason that it drives me a little bananas to hear people talk and kind of almost, it really does feel sometimes like it's a patronizing wagging of the finger at this black male problem, is because it's already happened to almost every other group. That's how most white men in this country live. They don't have any ties to any older institutions or any community that tells them. They're on the phone and they listen to you mentioned Ben Shapiro, they listen to Joe Rogan, they listen to whatever, and they have a very individualistic outlook, and so they vote Republican. And it's just the fixation on the it happening to the black male demographic, which again, right now, it's not as pronounced as most other male demographics because there's still this community hold. All right, Teresa in the audience.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, how are you?
Good, good. Okay. This isn't directly related to the election results, but it has to do with democracy. And it's not a question, it's a comment. So I'd like to hear what you two and the rest of the audience has to say. I'll just read it out, what I wrote down. Given the slide to authoritarianism in the US and around the world, as well as the widespread illiberalism on the Marxist left, I think the discussions on Radio Free Humanity this year, particularly episodes 117 and 120, concerning Marx's relationship to bourgeois democratic movements and radical republicanism, were especially important. By extension, I think episodes 112, 113, and 122, which discuss these themes indirectly, were also extremely important. There's a lot to say on these themes, but I'll just try to say one thing. I want to talk about what these discussions had to say about Marx's problem with liberal democracy. So what I understand from these discussions is that Marx's problem with liberal democracy was not that it emphasized individual rights and freedoms. His problem is that it was impossible to universally realize these rights and freedoms so long as there was capitalist relations of production. The problem with bourgeois democracy is that it's democracy only for the bourgeois. The problem with republicanism is that the republics we see today are republics belonging to capitalists and landowners. So I think there's a wide-ranging implications for practical work in both the political economic struggle in Marx's conception of freedom, which I see as being informed by but critical of bourgeois democracy, bourgeois democratic revolutions, and radical republicanism. But the point I want to make is about what this means for the work of Marxist theorists in the struggle to preserve and expand democracy. So a lot of people, a lot of workers would say that they appreciate their individual rights and freedoms. They would say that they would like to see these protected and expanded. If these desires and aspirations for individual rights and freedoms, collective rights and freedoms, etc., are the end of socialism, then is it really true that workers don't know their own interests? Is it then really the role of Marxist theorists to go around trying to inform people of what their best interests are, with something that leftists usually call consciousness raising? I would think not. I would think that the implication here, here meaning Marx's conception of freedom, but also the general desire for freedom amongst human beings, is that theoretical work that begins with the assumption that workers don't know what their own interests are is starting off on a faulty premise. But the main point I really want to make is that I think that Marx's conception of freedom, as discussed in these episodes, has implications for what the unique role of Marxist theorists is in the political struggle for democracy. I think our role is to help people in mass democratic movements identify exactly what is in the way of realizing their desires and aspirations. That is a major task of Marxist theorists, is try to clarify what is possible and what is impossible given capitalist relations of production. Over.
Oh my goodness, I've been muted this whole time. Thank you, Teresa, for that substantive comment that drew on so many of our episodes in the past year. Um, I really appreciated that. Andrew, would you like to come in on that?
Just on the issue that Teresa began with, I think it's quite right that what Marx was criticizing was not individualism and stuff. He was criticizing the fact that the aspirations that are embedded in, liberal democratic ideas cannot be realized within the current society. It's a really important point. I don't have anything new and profound to say about it. I've written a lot about this issue of him criticizing other left tendencies basically on this issue of what's possible and impossible. And it's an important issue because when he says he's not a utopian and they're utopians, he's basically saying, I'm with you in terms of what you want. We want the same thing, but that's not good enough because we have to make it happen. And the utopianism is not like the opposition to utopianism is not, it can't happen. The opposition to utopianism coming from Marx is it cannot happen in the way that you want, by messing with the distribution, by messing with the money system, time chits, whatever it might be. We need a social revolution that goes down into and transforms the relations of production. And that's a really hard one for so many people to get because, first of all, it's not on the surface, but second of all, because of just this idea that, political action will solve all the problems. And Marx is saying, no, It's got to be tied to something that's not just volitional. That's in terms of economic structures and interrelationships that are independent of our will. So it's not a new thought or a profound thought, but I haven't been able to I've had personal issues this week as well. So between the Trump victory and the personal issues, I do apologize. I'm not like at 100% here.
And Teresa, bringing that to us, drawing on the back catalog of the year of episodes, I mean, it couldn't be more of a relevant point this week. I mean, what MHI has been putting forward in the critique of Trumpism for nearly 9 years, nearly 10 years, is that liberal democracy has to be fought for and preserved against the Trumpists, and we're at a point now where to do that might require, as I've said on the show too, a more positive program that expands liberal democracy. But I think we all agree with this, and this won't will be just saying the obvious for the listeners, but it is possible to wrest back power from fascists and reassert liberal democracy. We've seen it happen historically several times. It's very, very difficult, but it can be done after terrors, usually after terrors, but it can be done. But, that won't in any way remove from the soil the nutrients that feed the next fascists that come along and prey on the weaknesses of the system and the society. And to avoid the threat of anything like a Trumpism, again, it's a total social revolution that changes the nature of production based around value. All of that being said, let's take one last question from an audience member, and then we'll take a bathroom break. Hello.
Hi. Sorry, microphone issues. Well, if I think my question should come after the statement, if you want, it's more related to that.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to read our Who We Are statement, and then we'll take a 3-minute bathroom break, Andrew?
Sure.
Okay. Marxist-Humanist Initiative, or MHI, aims to contribute to the transformation of this capitalist world by projecting, developing, and concretizing the philosophy of Karl Marx and its further development in the Marxist humanism articulated by Raya Dunovskaya. Today, amidst many wars, climate crises, social and political crises, is a moment to engage people in discussion of these ideas. In the US, we are faced with the threat of Trumpism triumphing and all-out authoritarianism extinguishing our right even to carry on such discussions. MHI is dedicated to the task of proving theoretically that an alternative to capitalism is possible. We are distinguished by our economic analyses in which we do not merely assert but demonstrate that the only opposite to the current world economic system is its abolition and replacement with one not based on the production of value. Because capitalism cannot be fundamentally reformed, attempts to reform it lead to an intensification of state capitalism and not to socialism. We are not a political party, nor are we trying to lead the masses, who will form their own organizations and whose emancipation must be their own act. But we have seen that spontaneous actions alone are insufficient to usher in a new society. We seek a new unity of philosophy and organization in which mass movements, striving for freedom, lay hold of Marxist philosophy of revolution and recreate society on its basis. Our ideas and actions, as well as our structure and rules, are guided by the interests of working people and freedom movements of people of color, LGBTQ people, other minorities, women, youth, and all those around the world who are struggling for self-determination in order to freely develop their own human natures. We have no interests separate and apart from theirs. To this end, we open our website and podcast the widest possible dialogue with people around the world. We intend to practice as well as to espouse a two-way road between our organization and people outside it as essential to developing a single dialectic in the relationship of theory to practice and as a way to ensure the survival of Marxist humanism. Our collective is working to create an organization so firmly rooted in its philosophy that it will not succumb to diversions that may arise from personal agendas, and that will be capable of developing and concretizing the philosophy over the long haul, regardless of who its members may be. It is no simple matter to create a democratic organization that is at the same time effective and able to resist efforts to divert it from its goals. We are aware that Marx never achieved an organization based on his philosophy, and that Dunevskaya's organization disintegrated following her death. But we have made progress in this matter with our principles and bylaws, and by recognizing that Marxist humanism cannot be carried on by chance or by individuals alone. An organization is needed in order to test and prove ideas. We invite all of you to join in this discussion and our initiative. So we'll resume at 2:20. I hope that gave everybody enough time to pour a cup of tea, grab a water, and dive back in. We had a question from the audience that requested to wait until after the Who We Are statement, so I'll turn it to them. We can't hear you.
Oh my gosh, I'm sorry.
There we
I
go.
keep forgetting about the button on the headset. My question is, what is the purpose of Radio Free Humanity? Is its purpose to educate, to create interesting discussions? And how does the purpose of Radio Free Humanity relate to MHI's purpose?
I'll let Andrew speak more substantively to that if he would like to, but one thing I'll say that we take very seriously, and a lot of work goes into production-wise, a lot of work and time and thought goes into production wise, is to not waste your time if you're listening, and to not just fill time and not just to put out an episode because we put out an episode every 2 weeks. It's we try very seriously to not just be bullshitting. I mean, that's a real guiding star. We're trying to actually substantially discuss and engage with things. And in the hope, I mean, I think for me, and I know Andrew and I have discussed this, in the real hope of starting a dialogue that doesn't end when the final music plays on the episode and that you just consume it passively and go about your day. The real hope is that something about that has engaged you enough that you're going to write a comment on the website, email in, start an exchange that might lead to another episode, that might lead to an article with sober senses, that might lead to us all gaining, a better understanding of something, Christ's sake.
Yeah, I mean, it's called Radio Free Humanity, the Marxist-Humanist podcast. So it is meant to be a Marxist-Humanist podcast. And it's meant to be the one of the ways in which Marxist-Humanist initiative communicates. We've got also, pamphlets. We've got the website. We've got the web publication with sober senses. We put on meetings, and those go on YouTube. We have semi-regular communications with a YouTube subscribers and email subscribers. The one thing that we're able to do kind of regularly, more or less, every 2 weeks is put on the podcast. And it's a little bit problematic because although we call it the Marxist-Humanist podcast and it's sponsored and hosted by Marxist-Humanist Initiative, you just have a couple of us guys. It's always been guys. It was one guy, now it's another guy. I've always been the other guy. Talking, and there is some sort of like backstop so that we don't put our foot in our mouth and say something stupid. But this is it's a podcast. It's not an academic paper. It's not a prospectus thesis that goes through the organization and is vetted and discussed and improved and so forth. So it's a special responsibility. It's daunting. I'm always very wary about what I say and how I say it, but it's like at a certain point you just have to say the alternative is not to say something, so we got to do it this way. But that's what we're trying to do, I think, is to be another platform for the projection, to some extent, concretization, like applying our principles and perspectives to the current situation. Maybe we're able at times to develop the philosophy and the political and theoretical positions to some extent. I know that, I've had a few times where, okay, we have to do something, we need an episode. Okay, so now it's time for me to sit down and write what I've been meaning to write for, in one case, it was 20 years. That was this past year when we had a discussion about Marx's critique of Derrida. I think that was 2 episodes in the end. I was meaning to write that for 2 decades, and I had never gotten around to it. So I did, because we needed a podcast episode. So, and I learned a lot while writing it. So to some extent, this spurs theoretical development, because I actually like what I wrote in the discussion of Marx's critique of Derrida at the front of the Grundrisse. One thing that to me has always been very important is to overcome the fragmentation and the curating that people like to do. They like to hear what we say about this, but they don't give whatever about what we say about that. They got their own views of that matter, and thank you very much. Well, what we're about is a philosophic, economic, political totality. Marxist humanism really is, a complete, integrated, well thought out, interpenetrating set of ideas that constitutes a philosophy. So among the things that we don't want to do and strive not to do is to separate theory and practice, discussion of philosophy and economics and theory from the current events. So from the very get-go, we have always had, as a part of the podcast, current events discussion. Sometimes it's better, sometimes it's worse, but it's always fairly current. And it means that we are keeping in touch with what's happening in the world and trying to say, Marxist humanism has got something to say about it. Here is what we say about it, and hopefully we can make ourselves a force in the world if we can get people who are willing to do what? Well, willing not to remain something that they have become, but are in the absolute movement of becoming. That's what we're looking for. People who strive not to remain what they have become, because what we've all become are things produced by capitalism.
Passive
We've got to move
consumers.
beyond that. Okay. So we got to get into the flow of making history ourselves. And we're looking for people who are down with that project, and that requires remaking yourself thoroughly. That's not what everybody wants to do, unfortunately. We've seen a lot of that with, the United States in the last 8-9 years. What do people want? They want to hear things that confirm their prejudices. They, reject what they don't like, no matter how factually correct it is. That is sending the world into a crisis of proportions that we've never seen before. And I mean this literally. I mean, just look at the climate crisis and the denial concerning that. That is a threat to continued human existence.
This is why we strain, I think, sometimes against the format of the podcast, because the format itself is conducive to being a passive consumer. People select the shows they listen to, and they listen to them on their drive to work or whatever. And they don't engage beyond that. They consume what, as Andrew points out, two white guys say into a microphone. And that's why we've done 2 ChatRFHs. That's why we're really trying to get engagement. Like, as Andrew says, it requires a complete remaking of who you are, because there are many, many people, and I'm sure there are listeners who fit this description, and I'm sure there are listeners who don't, but who know people who do, who are very well intentioned, very well meaning, very thoughtful, kind people who live passive lives politically. Their belief in a new society is down to what they read and what they listen to. They don't even talk about it with other people. And there's safety concerns about that, especially in a Trumpist America. I understand that to a large extent, but there are people who I knew someone who wore headphones at work and listened to this podcast and other materials on Marx while working in a warehouse where he never talked to anybody he worked with. He didn't talk to anybody he worked with. And he would go to work and he'd go home and he'd sit on the computer. And that's we all have to get over that kind of the atomization that's been done to us that we've been referring to too, and we have to be willing to engage collectively with a full philosophy of ideas and not just consume passively. Have to. Are we ready to move on to another question from the audience, Andrew? Okay. So this question was written from Jimmy, and he asks a question I think related to something that's been coming up a lot in the past year of shows, which is unions and the union movement right now. So he asks, do unions need to be marching from victory to victory before they can develop revolutionary potential? It seems to me that everyone basically takes this for granted, that if unions and or unionization drives and or rank and file movements are struggling or failing to meet their immediate goals, elections, contract negotiations, and so on, they can't possibly be expected to look beyond those struggles towards a new society. Does this need rethinking? Andrew, you want me to go first?
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Yeah, not only first, I don't know that I have any thoughts at all. So you go ahead.
Well, I would just say I think it's an interesting question that it's almost yes and no. I think Jimmy's getting at the fact that there's a fetishism among social democratic types, Jacobin types, Bernie Kratz, that if you just have unions active and building, and if we got union density to where it was in the 50s in this country again, everything would be hunky-dory. Well, the 50s happened in this country and union density was what it was. There wasn't a revolution or even near revolution in 1950s America because of union density. It's not the be all end all. I think Jimmy's raising an interesting point by talking about the revolutionary potential of unions. I mean, I think we try not to fetishize specific institutional forms, but talk about a deep engagement with a philosophy of revolution and a mass movement and what form that will take. I mean, you can have very, very large, even successful combative fighting unions that are not revolutionary at all. And then you can have very small, failing, flagging unions that have a sort of revolutionary posturing that doesn't really matter either way. So I would agree that it needs rethinking, especially among those that just have kind of a blanket fetishization of the union form as some kind of solution that will prefigure anything. Because I think that's a kind of shortcut style tendency in thinking that we reject outright. And now we have another question from the audience.
I don't know whether either of you have seen the interview that Jon Stewart of The Daily Show did with Ezra Klein from the New York Times, where he basically said that left and right no longer mean anything. And he was characterizing the American public as being largely non-ideological. So he was saying, yeah, there are the kind of hardcore ideological types, but they make up maybe 10, 15% at most of the electorate. Everybody else is in the middle, and they look for pragmatic solutions to the problems that they face in their lives. They're not motivated by any kind of ideological commitment to a way of seeing the world or anything at the level of big meta narratives of the way that the world works and how it's made. They just want policies that fix things for them, and they're quite pragmatic in the way that they do that.
And who was saying this, Jon Stewart or Ezra Klein?
Jon Stewart was saying it to an interview with Ezra Klein.
So the view that you're summarizing is the view of Jon Stewart.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay.
So in describing like the vast majority of Americans as non-ideological, obviously, I think Marxist-Humanists would be part of that 10 to 15% that would be regarded, whether we are or not is a secondary thing, but we would be regarded as ideological in the sense that having a certain way of understanding the interconnectedness of philosophical, political, and economic questions. And the thing that was interesting about Stewart and the end of left and right is what he described, and he talked about a shift that was going on. It's worth seeing this interview anyway. But my question is that when you look at someone like Bernie Sanders, who has criticized the focus of this presidential run by Kamala Harris has been too consumed with identity politics. And he's obviously putting forward that economic populist view. Given that most people seem to have responded to in some ways, to the ads that Trump was running, which focused primarily on two issues. One was immigration, and the other was the amount of money that trans people got. So if that kind of identification of woke, which is another way of saying it, identitarian politics, has kind of appealed to enough voters for Trump to squeeze in, do we need to double down on our defense of what is seen as work of civil rights for minorities and marginalized groups in order to say, look, any working class that's divided is not going to be able to resist what's coming. So those issues of democratic and civil rights for all kinds of people who are otherwise going to be thrown in the bus is something that we should rededicate ourselves to. Because if even the Bernie Sanders and the kind of left populists are not prepared to do that, then like all those kind of activists who were involved in the Black Lives Matter, who were involved in the Me Too, who were involved in kind of all these kind of civil rights discussions, they're going to be on their own, and that they're going to have nothing that politically represents them within the electoral process. And I'm not sure that that's a healthy thing to go on either. Obviously, there are Democrats who are saying that we're not going to abandon those people, but I mean, I'm sure that more people are going to draw the conclusion from these election results that we need to shift, or the Democrats need to shift in a more economic utilitarian direction rather than standing up for liberal rights. Over.
You want to respond, Gabriel? You want me to?
I'll jump in first and then add. I
Yeah.
think that brings in so much that we've discussed in current event segments and other episodes, because I think that what what I want to say, kind of that's almost perpendicular to that, is that the Bernie-crats and will always do this inane game that they do, where they say, "Look, our issues poll great even with Trumpists," and they say, "Oh, look, this particular issue will poll great." That means that they're social democrats in waiting, because they're in polling, they love this policy or that policy. It's usually Medicare for all, whatever, right? That's something that they do, and as if that indicates anything, and as if the opinions on these matters from issue to issue are completely in stone among the American electorate. That's how they act. That, oh, they support Medicare for all because they do it in polling, even done by Fox News, and that's not how it works. I think what that Jon Stewart is kind of getting at in a typical Jon Stewartian way is that the American electorate can be very in flux on these issues. I mean, we went from 2020, American voters were the most pro-immigration in that election in exit polling that they had been in decades, to now 2024, they're the most anti-immigration that they've been since polling on the matter has begun, right? And it's because the Trumpists successfully dominated the political scene, and they made that the agenda issue, right? And so I think that's what Stewart's getting at in terms of a sort of a non-ideological mass is these things are mutable, and there's a chunk of American voters that kind of flow with the wind. But the real pressing concern is that we don't have a chunk of American voters that flow with the wind anymore. We have at least a third of this country that are committed Trumpists, and they have their eyes on the prize of smothering people's civil rights. So to what Robbie's saying, any truly anti-Trumpist politics that hopes to crush this has to be an anti-Trumpist politics that isn't just for protecting existing rights, but is expanding them. I mean, I think that's and anybody who's conceding that right now or trying to walk backwards into this sort of we're not going to talk about these issues. Even the soft version of it of we'll still, protect these groups, but we won't talk about it as much. Talking about it hurts us. Talking about it hurts us with these people. Of course, it hurts us with those people because these people are fascist. That's why it hurts us with them. So you have to, don't worry about getting hurt with them. We have to crush them, and we're not going to do it. There's also a utilitarian element of this, which is not why I'm in favor of it. I'm in favor of it because we're Marxist-Humanists and we're for human liberation and freedom movements among minorities and people fought on their own terms. But there's this utilitarian element that it is impossible to beat the Trumpists without the people they're looking to smother, without undocumented workers, without trans people, without gay people, without black people. It's impossible. It's impossible. And if that ground's conceded, they might as well win. Which maybe they already have.
Yeah, I'll come in. I think one thing that Ravi said is of utmost importance, and that is the overarching narrative that needs to come from our side, that is, in this case, an agent-centered narrative. It's not a conspiracy theory in the bad sense, because it's actually a conspiracy in the sense that people get together and do this. The rulers maintain their rule by dividing and ruling over, by dividing and conquering the exploited and oppressed. Men versus women, white versus black, straight versus gay, etc., 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 native born versus immigrant, and so forth. Okay. This is what needs to be communicated. This is what people need to understand when they are directing their wrath against, this other. This is being manufactured consciously in order so that they don't look for Mr. Big. Okay, it's an old point, but it's no less valid than it's ever been. We got to say that. We're not, Gabriel's right. We're not going to get a receptive response, when we say that among the try to say that to Trump white voters. They want to blame the vermin Marxists and the globalist Jews and all the rest. In terms of any of this being about economic distress and all that stuff, there seems to be that kind of thing going on in this latest election. And I'm not totally discounting it. One thing I can assure you, within the next few months, no more than a few months, you're going to see a massive turnaround in the consumer confidence, people's perceptions of how the economy is doing and is expected to do, and all of your Trump voters and all of your Republicans, right? They're going to be saying the economy is great. Okay. This is not new. I can predict this because this happens again and again and again. I wrote about this. There's an article with Sober Census that alludes to it. It's a book review called, my book review was called The Baseness of Trump's Base. It was a review of something about identity crisis, a political science book called Identity Crisis. This happens again and again. People form their perceptions, quote, close quote, of the economy based on their political allegiances. So the causation is the opposite. It's the reverse of what most people think. People think, okay, you got some economic views, realities, perceptions, and they determine the politics. But when it comes to these kinds of questions, it's the other way around. Yeah, I mean, Bernie Sanders said it was very unhelpful and typical of Bernie Sanders grandstanding. I mean, Bernie Sanders was, I heard him time and again praising Biden economic policies. Look, Biden's economic policies were as far left as he could push them. And Bernie Sanders knows that very well. This was not Bill Clinton's, economic policies. This was not Obama's economic policies. Sanders knows very well, why Biden was unable to go further. It's because of Republican opposition and people like Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, neither of whom has any political future anymore. This thing that Jon Stewart said is absolutely correct, but it has always been correct. There has always been about 10% of the population that is politically engaged, that could tell you what the three branches of government are and how they're different from one another, that knows the name of their congressperson, their two senators, the president, the vice president, can name at least one justice on the Supreme Court. There's very few people that can do this. People have never paid much attention to the news. Rachel Bitecofer, who's a political pundit, political science analyst, said, what was the number one political story in the United States last year? It was the balloons from China, the errant surveillance balloon. I mean, that's the level at which people process and take in political information by and large. And it's never been different. I remember back in the old days, I was growing up early 70s. What you would have among most people, they would never say, have any political discussion except right before the election. And then, one person would have a one-liner and the other person would have a one-liner. And that was 3 or 4 minutes, and then they were back to their normal stuff. People don't like politics. They don't understand it at all. Okay, that's the really big issue. Why people are so disengaged from politics, why there is such alienation, and it has to do with this kind of representative democracy stuff, whereby people are not, part of a movement where the politics is a matter of their doing. And so you get these crises that we have. So it's always been like 10%. Okay, what you used to have then, and to some extent you still have, is what about the other people? Well, some people vote a certain way because that's the way their parents voted, or they look for a D or they look for an R, because they know that's their side. And we still have a whole lot of that. One of the bigger problems we have is that we've had a realignment in this country. So large portions of the working class shifted from I vote D to I vote R because the Democrats are woke and, they're for the darkies and all of this kind of stuff. It is not the case that 85 to 90% of the people are up for grabs, if that's the implication of what Jon Stewart was saying. People are not in the middle in that way. They've got a party preference. They're either a member of a party, or they're not a member, but they're registered as part of a party, or else most of the remaining people who are independents, they still are, Republican in all but name, or Democrat in all but name. There's a few people in the middle, not that many, maybe 10%, maybe 12%, maybe 8%, not that many people. So this is, as we've had more polarization, so-called, in the country, that number of the percentage of free-floating voters has shrunk, which is why we get all of these extremely close elections. So people are not ideological in that sense, that Jon Stewart is talking about, where they have a set of beliefs and views that are coherent. What we do have, like I mentioned, real stunner, we got people who, want abortion to be legal and accessible, and a quarter of them are voting for Trump. So this is part of the problem. This non-ideological stuff means seat of the pants reactions to one thing as if it were disconnected from another, not seeing the connection and so forth. It's an absolutely huge problem. Ravi, what was the takeaway? What was the message that Jon Stewart was trying to convey with these facts about 90% or 85% of people not being ideological? What lesson was he trying to draw from that? Ravi. Earth to Ravi. Earth to Ravi.
He should be able to unmute now. I just changed.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. He was largely talking about the media and the way in which it has shifted and the way that media works as a reflection of the people who watch it. So he was talking about it's not so much that there's been a rightward shift amongst the population as a whole. He said that that's remained fairly constant. And that's where the whole characterization of the ideological types. But he was saying the nature of the engagement of the media has shifted, and he talked about the kind of the right creating parallel institutions during the 1980s, and he goes on about what's his name, Ailes,
Roger Ailes of Fox News, yes.
Yeah. Roger Ailes, Fox News, and him having a kind of conscious strategy to basically have a dismissal of anything that smacked of progressive ideas or wokeness, as we call it now, or anything that smacked of left was recharacterized as being woke, like warriors. And the whole Fox orientation was to try and reorient the kind of media landscape in such a way that everything was shifted rightwards. Jon Stewart's argument is that the public haven't really shifted with it, but the nature of the engagement is that they are forced. The polarization that's taken place in media has, to some extent, engaged people, but it doesn't reflect the true nature of the American public. I think that was his takeaway point.
This wasn't Ezra Klein that was saying this. This was Jon Stewart, because it sounds much like Ezra Klein too.
Well, there was a back and forth, and they were shaping each other, and he was responding to line raised.
Yeah, that's all valid, I think. Yeah,
it's worth watching.
Yeah, the point is valid. It's really interesting. I was looking at some things recently where people have this idea that the people in the middle, who are not like either registered Democrats or close to them, or Republicans or close to them, they have this idea that these people are moderates. And actually, it's not the case. There's almost no moderates in the country. Your moderates are like your Joe Manchins, and I don't know what, Mitt Romney or something. What people are is inconsistent.
Yes.
Hugely inconsistent. They've got very strong opinions, just like, any guy at the end of a bar you're going to hear. It's got very strong opinions, but they're, if, you're a political scientist, you'll say, well, that one's on the left, that opinion's on the right, that one's on the left, that one's on the right. And you average them out and it's in the middle. But what this person has is a bunch of extreme opinions.
Yeah.
right? They're just
Flip-flopping.
mouthing off and saying extreme things, and that's
a
lot of the so-called moderates.
A moderate voter is someone who, wants open borders, but the death penalty for abortion. It's like that.
Exactly. That's exactly it.
And it goes right to the same point that we've been getting at too, of just this breakdown of being tied to an organization or a community or a movement or a Rotary Club that's tied to a political project that has an agenda, because they're curating their political beliefs and opinions and holding to them, usually fairly strongly, on this very individual basis. And we have gotten so used to this in this country that it's kind of shocking when we see something different. We mentioned Atlanta before, and Atlanta being one of the only places in the country where Democrats did better this time because of Black church mobilization. There's a case where the Black voters in Atlanta voted, for the Democrats, for Harris, and they also voted for an abortion referendum, even though many of those people are very religious, and religious in a way and in a sense where they're personally opposed to abortion. But because they believe themselves to be part of a political project that has a line, and they're part of it, and they're mobilized by their church, they voted for it. And so, but with the moderate voters, it's just a collection. It's like a coterie of oddballs and weirdos. To what John Stewart was saying, though, that Ravi brought us, I mean, we can't forget that the Trumpists are not a majority, even though they want to present themselves as being so. They can't really be a majority. And they're, despite all as Trump put it, we had, I forget the phrase he used, we had legacy media. We had legacy media appearances or something like that from holding over, and that's cheap. And that's why his campaign was cheap. They're on the news all the time. Trump has been in 3 successive presidential elections. He did very well in this one, but he did not win a majority of this country, and a majority of this country does not approve of him. And there is a ceiling to how much a popularity he can get. And we should be mindful of that. I think we have time for maybe one more. I have some written in. I have one from Felipe. I have one. Here, Floyd, go ahead.
Thank you. First of all, just to say solidarity to all to all comrades in the USA and stuff. Obviously, you're going through a very tough time, and hopefully you won't have to hopefully you won't have to take sanctuary in any sanctuary city as a result, of what Trump plans to do. The thing is, though, it was mentioned about woke politics and about how it's an impact on the elections in the USA. And the UK context is that back in 2019, I was involved with a lot of people on the Labour left and also in the trade unions with regards to the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn. And as a result of the massive defeat of the Labour Party and of what was termed then left-wing politics, a number of people on the left, some of them were around the CP, but others weren't. But there seemed to be building up, at least temporarily anyway, a consensus that the reason why the LP lost was because it was focused too much on trans issues, on anti-racism, on fighting sexism and misogyny, and on attempting to fight climate change and all the rest of it and stuff. Now, normally those things wouldn't have been given the time of day, but because of what was seen as an ideological defeat of the left, that a number of people seem to at least temporarily give that more of a nod than they should. You then fast forward to the elections here again in the UK in 2024, where the Tories, in a run-up to it, tried to fight the culture war and make that the central plank of their campaign. Now, for various reasons, that attempt to demonize refugees and migrants, to demonize trans people and to normalize racism, that failed. Now, obviously, there isn't time to go into it here and stuff, but it just seemed, that there was a rejection of large planks of the culture war over here, which I thought was interesting. Although the new leader of the Tory party, a black woman, Kemi Badenoch, seems intent on carrying on the campaign. But the point is that you had a rejection here, and the rejection of it was being made by people supporting the Labour Party, and the Labour Party is no longer left. It is. I would term it centre. Sorry, I would term it centre right. In the US context, would you say that it's been the opposite in terms of people have fallen for, if that's the right term, the culture war as it is termed, over in the US, and indeed has the success of the culture war, if we like, gone into the response of certain minorities, to Trump, such as Latinos, and to a lesser extent black men and all the rest of it and stuff. Things like the manosphere, for example. Has that played, and with regards to how men see themselves, in relation to what was termed the woke policies, of the, let's say, Democrats, things like that and stuff.
Thank you for bringing us to that to end on. One thing I'll point to is that from 2016 to now, Trump at the time of the 2016 presidential election, the phrase I often heard was he played footsie with white supremacists and open white supremacism. And people around him, not so much him, but people around him had enough sense to keep those people at arm's length. And you brought up the manosphere types too, like the explicit misogynist ideologues who make whole careers out of shelling misogyny, kept them at somewhat arm's length, not because of him or any personal belief, but because people around him thought this doesn't look very good. That's not the case anymore with the Trump campaign of 2024. He's fully embraced those people. He has meals with them. He has meals with Nick Fuentes, who's an open anti-Semite, explicitly describes himself as such, open racist, explicitly describes himself as such, open white nationalist, open misogynist, right? Like he has embraced that, and to the point
what
where
is it he said right after the election? Your body, my choice.
Your body, my choice. And Fuentes and people, these sort of fringe culture warriors, as you're calling them, Floyd, they were able to make a buck being provocateurs and getting their little coteries of Nazis, because those people are very committed and they recognize that in their view, a person who's publicly espousing those views through a podcast or YouTube videos or whatever, they risk being employed by any place that doesn't want to employ a Nazi, which is most. So they give them chunks of change. There's also a lot of dark money in that. They get money from like some people who have big bucks who stay behind the scenes and give them money. But that's how they survive for years. They've now ridden Trump to having great prominence. Fuentes had like 70,000 people streaming into his election night live show. 70,000 people watched a man who said his goal is to be the 21st century Goebbels. That's what he described as his goal for his life. The 21st century Goebbels. He said, I don't want to be Hitler. People say that about me. I want to be Goebbels. He had 70,000 people viewing. And this used to be a fringe figure who had a couple of very committed people. 70,000 people turned in for his election night coverage, and they could be watching any channel. So Trump has embraced the culture warriors. He's embraced the white supremacists. He's embraced the misogynists. And by his embracing, he's elevated them. That whether or not that means people have endorsed the culture war here, I don't think so. I think it's just fascist supporting fascist. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw something in this country. I wouldn't be surprised. I would expect like the race riots that you had in England that was stirred up by the same people that pushed the turning point line. What's Farage's party? Change UK,
Reform.
that pushed this narrative and stirred up those race riots, right? We have seen a spike in hate crimes. We've seen a spike in racialized violence. That's who these people are. That's who they are.
Yeah, I differ with one aspect of this. I mean, there are the particular niche communities, manosphere, this and that culture thing among the bros, among, evangelicals, all kinds of stuff. But the overriding culture war is a very old thing that they dusted off the right wing. They've been very successful. It has some economic basis. I'm going to try to be very brief, but it's basically anti-intellectualism. Okay, so it's hatred of cosmopolitan people, which, a lot of it means Jews, liberals, just city people, expertise, experts, science. There is nothing new about this. This is the oldest crap in the world, and it's the division between town and country. And this has become a huge deal in the United States. In this latest election, the rural, and probably outer suburban areas went even more strongly to Trump than they had done before. What Kamala Harris seems to have been unable to do is to sufficiently grow her vote share in the cities and suburbs. And that is the real gut of the culture war, it seems to me, is those kinds of attitudes. And the Republican Party that Trump killed off and replaced with his MAGA crap, these were people who were, bought into expertise and rules and sort of, they were okay with mainstream culture by and large. Even abortion. The Republican Party in the early 70s was in favor of abortion rights, right? So there is a huge cultural divide. They have been very successful in turning a very large segment of the country. They've been successful in turning their anti-intellectual attitudes and prejudices and suspicion of experts and all of that. They've been very successful in turning that into politics. They've made that into a political divide, whereas before it wasn't. Okay, and so we've always had that cultural divide. It's become a bigger political divide because they've been able, Ailes and others have been able to marry those two things. And also, I mean, I got to say, over the past 50 years or so, this has an economic basis in globalization, in the creation of all kinds of new information industries and so forth. The old economies that, used to exist, that, you would have like auto production and auto part production and stuff in rural areas, you don't. The rural areas have become largely rusted out. There's no opportunity there. All the opportunities in the cities. So the people from those areas who are go-getters and want to try to survive and maybe even thrive in the new kind of economy, they move to the cities and so forth. And the people who want no part of it, they stay there and they get angrier and angrier. Nobody has any kind of plan. Certainly the Trumpites don't, to revitalize rural communities and so forth.
I think that brings us to more than time. We went a little over. Um, I'd like to thank everybody who came and joined us today for ChatRFH. I'd like to thank everybody who asked a question. I'd like to thank everybody who didn't. As we've talked about in this, this is about doing more than just having a podcast that we passively put out and listeners passively consume. We're facing a very, very dire situation on the world stage. And what it demands of us is to do better than we have been doing individually and collectively. It demands that we have do serious theoretical work to understand what we face and to not repeat lines that should be dead, which much of the left is doing in response to this, or they're sticking their head in the sand. We on the left have a responsibility to recognize the seriousness of this crisis. And if you can join us in that work through conversation, through asking questions, through joining MHI, I couldn't encourage you more to do so. And the only other thing I had to say is that a fascist and a Trumpist, uh, that's a coward. And it's a serious situation. We should be alarmed, but don't show fear to these people because we can defeat them. We have to defeat them. We must defeat them, and we have to do everything in our power to do so. Andrew, any last words?
Yeah, just very briefly, one thing I keep thinking about apropos of your last point is the reason the Trump vote keeps growing is that the people who support Trump, not only Trump, but the people who support Trump have faced no consequences thus far.
Not a one. Not a one. And as I said, we know a fascist is a coward. We know the first phase of a real, sound, true defeat. They go scuttling away and they hide. They've done it in other places. They could do it here, but we can't fear them. We have to recognize what they are and how dangerous they are and do what we can to defeat them. And that we'll call it there. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.